The HOA Karen called 911 on my Halloween decorations, then the cops turned on her. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. Halloween had always been my favorite time of the year. The smell of melting candles, the sound of children laughing, the sight of glowing pumpkins on every porch, it all made me feel like a child again. I had spent weeks preparing my Halloween display with care and excitement. My front yard had become a little world of wonder, filled with fog creeping along the grass, pumpkins glowing softly, and lights strung between the trees like floating spirits. At the center stood a tall witch figure with red eyes that flickered in the dark whenever someone walked by. It was playful, spooky, and harmless. For me, it was about community, about giving the neighborhood children something to smile about. But not everyone shared that joy. Across the street lived Karen, the self-appointed guardian of order and misery in our small suburban neighborhood. She had been the head of the HOA for years, and she wore that position like a crown. Every week she found something new to complain about. She had once fined a neighbor for having a bird bath that did not match the color of their house. She had even sent a warning to a family for leaving their garbage cans out 2 hours past the approved time. To her, rules were not about structure but about power. And this Halloween, she had found a new target, my yard. Every night as I worked on my decorations, I could see her shadow behind her curtain. Sometimes, I saw the faint flash of her phone camera capturing photos of my setup. It was almost amusing at first. I thought she would complain, send a letter, and move on. But this year, she seemed determined to make me the villain of the neighborhood. She told others my fog machine was a safety hazard, that my witch figure encouraged dark behavior, that the music playing faintly at night disturbed her peace. I ignored her because I knew I had done nothing wrong. The evening of Halloween arrived clear and cool. The sky glowed orange before fading into deep blue. I lit the candles inside the pumpkins, turned on the fog machine, and played the soft track of ghostly laughter that made children giggle as they approached. The first trick-or-treaters came just as the streetlights flickered on. Their small footsteps echoed along the pavement, and their laughter filled the air. Parents waved and smiled, happy to see life in the neighborhood again. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. Then I saw her porch light blink twice. That was her signal, the same one she used whenever she prepared to act. She stepped out of her house holding her phone like it was a badge of authority. Her expression was already tight with disapproval. She looked around as if searching for a reason to end the fun. Children froze for a moment, sensing the tension. Parents whispered and glanced away, hoping she would simply return inside. But Karen never retreated when attention was involved. She began walking toward my yard, muttering to herself, shaking her head at every sound, every light, every small decoration. I stayed calm and continued handing out candy. I refused to let her ruin the night. She stood at the edge of my lawn, phone raised, recording every inch of my display. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear that this was a violation of HOA rules and that my decorations were offensive to community values. Her voice cut through the cheerful noise of the evening. Some parents rolled their eyes and moved along, but others stopped, unsure of what to do. I gave the children extra candy and told them to enjoy the night. When she realized no one was reacting, her frustration deepened. She pointed her phone at the fog machine and shouted that it was a fire hazard. She pointed at the lights and said they were blinding drivers. She pointed at the witch figure and called it inappropriate for children. The more she shouted, the more absurd she sounded. People began filming her. A group of teenagers laughed quietly behind their masks. That only enraged her further. Suddenly she turned away, stormed to her driveway, and began speaking loudly into her phone. I heard fragments of her words like disturbance, safety concern, and illegal activity. At first I thought she was bluffing. Karen had threatened to call the authorities many times before. But the way she paced, the way she described my decorations with exaggerated panic, made me realize she had actually called 911. The street grew quiet as her voice carried through the cool night air. Neighbors stood watching from their porches. Children clutched their candy bags, unsure what was happening. I felt a wave of disbelief and anger rise in me, but I kept my composure. I smiled at the parents nearby and said softly that everything would be fine. Inside, though, I was boiling. She had taken her obsession to another level, and she was doing it in front of everyone. She hung up and stood proudly at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, waiting for her triumph to arrive. The sirens began faintly in the distance, growing louder with every second. She smiled as if justice were finally being delivered. I stood by my porch steps, calm but alert. The children resumed talking, and the fog swirled gently around their feet. The scene looked surreal, as if Halloween itself was holding its breath. When the red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street, people began whispering. The police car stopped near my driveway. Karen rushed forward, waving her hands dramatically, pointing toward my house as if she had just uncovered a criminal operation. The officers stepped out slowly, observing the decorations, the families, the laughing children, and then her. One of them asked a few quiet questions. She gestured wildly toward my witch, toward the fog, toward the music. They looked unimpressed. I stayed still, waiting. The officer finally walked toward me and asked if everything was all right. I nodded and told him that it was just a Halloween celebration. He looked around and saw the families smiling and the children holding candy. He turned back to Karen, his expression calm but serious. The tone of his voice changed as he asked her if she was the one who had called. She straightened her back proudly and said yes. The next few seconds felt like slow motion. The officer folded his arms, looked around again, and told her that everything seemed perfectly fine. He explained that noise levels were within limits and that the decorations were harmless. Karen's face froze. She tried to argue, claiming the neighborhood was under moral threat. The officer raised a hand gently to stop her. Then he asked her to lower her voice because she was now disturbing the peace she claimed to protect. The entire crowd watched in stunned silence. Parents began whispering, some hiding smiles behind their hands. The teenagers burst out laughing. Karen's face turned red, her voice cracked, and she started stumbling over her words. The officer politely suggested she return home if she had no further concerns. The humiliation on her face was visible even through the fog. As the police car left, the air filled with applause from the parents and cheers from the children. Karen turned around and walked back to her house in silence, her shoulders stiff, her power crumbling with every step. I turned back to the kids and handed out the last pieces of candy with a calm smile. The laughter returned, louder than before. Halloween was saved, and the Queen of Complaints had finally been defeated by her own need for control. The morning after Halloween, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. The street that had been alive with laughter and light only hours earlier now looked dull and tense, as if joy itself had been swept away during the night. When I opened my door, I found 3 neatly folded letters taped to it, each sealed with the emblem of the Homeowners Association. I already knew who was behind them. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakable tall, sharp letters pressed into the paper with the kind of force only anger could create. I stood there for a moment, holding them in my hand, wondering how far this woman would go to prove she could control everyone. I opened the first letter and read the words written in a tone that could have cut glass. It accused me of creating excessive noise and disturbing community order. The second letter listed supposed violations of HOA decoration policy, claiming that my use of fog machines, lights, and sound systems was unauthorized. The third one was the worst. It said I had violated the spirit of neighborhood harmony and created a public nuisance. It was signed, as always, by the HOA president herself, the same woman who had called the police on a night meant for children. I could almost see her smirk as she taped them to my door. What stung more than her accusations was what came after. By the time I went inside and opened my phone, the neighborhood group chat was already filled with her posts. She had uploaded photos of my yard taken during the party, twisting the story to make herself look like a victim. She called it an act of disrespect, a disruption to peace, a personal attack on her values. Each sentence dripped with condescension, and the worst part was that some of the neighbors agreed. I scrolled through the comments, feeling my chest tighten with disbelief. People I had smiled at for years, people whose children had played in my yard, were suddenly agreeing that I had gone too far. Others stayed silent, afraid to speak against her. Her control over them was subtle but complete. For a few minutes, I considered taking everything down. I thought maybe if I just removed the decorations, she would leave me alone. But that thought disappeared as quickly as it came. I had done nothing wrong. I had followed every rule, every guideline, every curfew. This wasn't about regulations. It was about power. She couldn't stand the idea that someone could bring joy to the neighborhood without her approval. And I wasn't about to let her win. This year, Halloween had become more than a holiday. It was a statement of defiance against control, a reminder that not everyone bows to intimidation. Later that day, as I walked to my mailbox, I could feel eyes watching me. Curtains twitched, and blinds shifted just enough for me to catch glimpses of faces hiding behind them. The woman across the street pretended to water her plants, but I saw the way she kept glancing at me. Karen's influence had spread like a stain. People were afraid of being her next target, so they avoided me instead. I smiled and waved, refusing to let them see any weakness. If there was one thing she thrived on, it was fear. In the afternoon, I heard a knock on the door. It was a delivery man carrying a stack of printed HOA notices. Apparently, the president had decided to send formal letters to everyone in the community, reminding them of proper holiday conduct. My name was highlighted at the bottom of the example list as a warning. I read it twice, my hands trembling with disbelief. The notice described my decorations as excessive, inappropriate, and disruptive to the moral standard of the neighborhood. I could almost hear her voice reading it aloud with pride. She wanted to humiliate me publicly, to make an example of me. But all she did was light a fire I didn't know I had. That evening, I stood outside staring at my yard. The fog machine was silent, the lights were off, and the witch figure stood motionless in the fading light. I imagined her sitting in her living room across the street, smiling at her temporary victory. My mind was calm, but my heart was alive with a quiet, determined anger. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who had been pushed into silence by someone who enjoyed authority more than community. I wasn't going to let her turn our neighborhood into her personal kingdom. I took out my phone and opened the same group chat she had used to shame me. I posted a simple message. I thanked everyone who had joined the Halloween event and shared photos of the children smiling, families laughing, and decorations glowing in the night. I wrote that joy doesn't need permission. I didn't mention her name, but I didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who the message was about. Within minutes, the chat exploded with reactions. Some neighbors apologized for staying silent. Others shared their own frustrations with the way the HOA had been run. The shift was small but real. For the first time, people began to speak without fear. As the night fell, I walked around the yard again, replacing the lights she had complained about with even brighter ones. I arranged the pumpkins neatly, cleaned up the leaves, and reset the fog machine. Every small movement felt like an act of quiet rebellion. Across the street, her window light flickered. I could sense her watching me, realizing that her intimidation hadn't worked. I smiled, not out of spite, but because I finally understood her weakness. She needed control to feel powerful. Take that away, and she was just another neighbor hiding behind complaints and rules. When I went back inside, I sat by the window and watched her house. The air was still. For once, her blinds stayed shut. The group chat continued buzzing with comments supporting my message, each one a small crack in the wall she had built around the neighborhood. I knew this was far from over. People like her never let go easily. But for now, the silence outside felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 letters taped to my door, the word she had chosen so carefully to wound me. But instead of pain, I felt something stronger. I realized that sometimes revenge isn't loud or angry. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stand tall when someone expects you to bow. The next morning, I would wake up and continue decorating. I would make my yard brighter, louder, and more joyful than ever. And when she tried to stop me again, I would be ready. This wasn't just about Halloween anymore. It was about taking back the right to live without fear in a place that had forgotten what community meant. Halloween night had arrived with the kind of crisp air that carries excitement. The sky shimmered in shades of deep purple and soft orange, the moon low and round like a silent witness. Families filled the street, and laughter echoed between houses decorated with cobwebs and glowing lanterns. The smell of caramel mixed with the sweetness of pumpkin spice drifting from open doors. The fog machine in my yard was working perfectly, rolling a white mist across the grass that made everything look enchanted. The children ran through it, giggling as they waved their hands in the smoky air. Parents chatted on the sidewalks, smiling as they watched their kids trade candy. Everything was exactly as I had imagined, a night of joy, color, and life. Then came the sound I had started to recognize, the slam of a screen door cutting through the laughter. The woman from across the street appeared again, this time wearing a bathrobe and slippers, her face twisted with fury. Her voice tore through the peaceful hum of the night as she shouted that evil had taken over the neighborhood. Everyone turned to look. For a moment, the children froze, unsure if this was part of the show. Her robe flapped in the wind, her hair wild, her hand gripping her phone like a weapon. She pointed toward my yard, yelling that it was a display of wickedness, that I was spreading corruption among the children, that I had no respect for decent people. Parents whispered quietly, some guiding their children away, others shaking their heads. But most stayed. They knew this was another of her scenes. The kids looked confused, standing between fear and amusement. I stood near the porch steps, keeping my expression calm. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but I stayed quiet. I could see her pacing now, breathing heavily, looking around for anyone who would agree with her. But no one did. The more she spoke, the more isolated she became. Her voice echoed in the night, desperate for attention that refused to come. When she realized no one was reacting, she grew louder. She accused me of violating community peace, of mocking religion, of organizing a public disturbance. Her words had no rhythm, only rage. Her eyes darted from one neighbor to another, searching for someone who would validate her anger. All she found were tired faces and quiet laughter. A father nearby whispered something to his son, and they both smiled. That small moment of amusement made her snap. She shouted that she would not be disrespected in her own neighborhood. Then she raised her phone, pressed it to her ear, and began to speak in the sharp, exaggerated tone of someone playing the role of a victim. Her voice carried clearly through the still air. She told the dispatcher that there was a dangerous situation, that people were causing chaos, that the noise was unbearable and that children were being exposed to inappropriate images. I felt the anger rise in me, but beneath it was disbelief. She was actually calling the police. Around me, the parents exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them recorded the scene, whispering that she was losing her mind. The children clung to their candy bags, unsure if the fun was over. I stood still, watching her pace like a performer on a stage built out of her own rage. When she hung up, she looked around with a triumphant expression, as if she had just saved the neighborhood from disaster. She straightened her robe, lifted her chin, and crossed her arms. I could almost see the pride swelling in her chest as she imagined herself being praised by the officers for her civic duty. I stayed silent, pretending to adjust the decorations, though my heart was pounding with a mix of fury and anticipation. I knew she had gone too far this time. Her call would not expose me. It would expose her. The night shifted. The laughter dimmed as people waited for what would happen next. Even the fog seemed to move slower, the air thicker with tension. Minutes passed, then the faint sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. The woman's face lit up with satisfaction. She began pacing again, rehearsing her speech, muttering to herself about neighborhood standards and responsibility. Some neighbors moved to the edges of their lawns, curious but calm. Others whispered to their children that everything would be fine. When the red and blue lights finally appeared at the end of the street, a hush fell over everyone. The cars stopped near my driveway, and the lights reflected off the windows, turning the pumpkins into glowing orbs of orange and blue. The woman rushed forward before the officers even stepped out, pointing at my house, talking so fast that her words tangled together. Her voice was trembling, but not from fear, from excitement. She thought this was her victory. She gestured toward the decorations, the children, the fog, calling it an unsafe and immoral event. The officers stood still for a moment, scanning the scene. One of them looked at the decorations, at the children playing, at the parents chatting calmly nearby. His expression didn't change. The other officer took a slow step forward, his flashlight cutting through the fog. The woman kept talking, repeating herself, waving her arms dramatically. I could see the officers exchanging glances. They didn't look convinced. One of them asked her to calm down and explain clearly what the problem was. She paused, stumbled over her words, then pointed at the witch figure in my yard, calling it offensive. The officer's expression stayed neutral. He turned to me and asked softly if I was the homeowner. I nodded. He asked if I was hosting an event. I said it was a small Halloween gathering for local families. He looked around again, taking in the sight of laughing children and peaceful parents. Then he turned back to her. The silence stretched between them like a drawn curtain. She began to speak again, but this time her words faltered. The officers thanked me for cooperating and told me everything looked fine. Then one of them turned toward her and said that the only disturbance they could identify was the noise of her shouting. The crowd erupted in quiet laughter. Parents smiled, children giggled behind their masks, and I stood motionless, watching her face crumble. The confidence drained from her eyes as she tried to argue. The officer raised his hand gently and told her the matter was closed. She turned, shaking her head, and stormed back to her house, the folds of her robe trailing behind her like a defeated cape. The fog swallowed her silhouette as she disappeared through her door. When the officers left, the laughter returned, louder than before. The air felt lighter again. I stood on my porch, looking across the street, knowing this was only the beginning. She had called for control and found humiliation instead. And deep inside, I knew she would not forget it. The flashing lights painted the street in streaks of red and blue, swirling across the pumpkins like a living warning. The laughter that had filled the night suddenly faded into quiet uncertainty. The children stopped running. The parents fell still, holding their phones close as if afraid to breathe. Even the fog from my machine seemed to hesitate, curling around the ground like a curious spirit waiting to see what would happen next. The air carried the faint hum of the police car's engine, steady and patient, while everyone watched in silence. I could see the woman across the street standing proudly at the edge of her driveway, hands on her hips, her robe glowing in the flashing lights like a flag of authority. She looked triumphant, certain that her moment had come. The car doors opened slowly and two officers stepped out, calm and deliberate. Their expressions held the same steady neutrality of people used to sorting truth from drama. They scanned the scene, their eyes passing over the decorations, the families, the children, and finally resting on the woman already marching toward them. She moved fast, her slippers slapping the pavement, her voice rising in a sharp rhythm. She pointed toward my yard as if she were guiding them to evidence of a crime. She began listing offenses with exaggerated urgency, words like illegal activity and public safety spilling from her mouth as though she were describing a riot instead of a Halloween party. Her tone was full of pride, the kind of confidence that comes from someone who truly believes they are right. The officers listened for a few seconds without interrupting, one of them taking notes while the other glanced around. I stood still on my porch, my arms folded loosely, my face calm. Inside, my pulse was racing, but I refused to show it. The children watched with wide eyes, their parents whispering softly to reassure them. The whole neighborhood had turned into an audience for her performance. The longer she spoke, the more her voice trembled with a mix of excitement and desperation. She pointed again toward my house, claiming the fog could be toxic, that the sounds were disturbing people, that the entire event was out of control. Her words hung in the cold night air, heavy and absurd. When she finally paused to catch her breath, one of the officers thanked her for bringing her concerns forward. Then he looked around slowly. The street was quiet except for the faint laughter of children nearby. The lights from my decorations glowed softly, casting playful shadows on the fences. A few parents waved from their porches, some trying not to smile. The officer turned back to her, his expression unreadable, and asked in a calm voice if she could show him exactly what the problem was. She hesitated, her confidence cracking slightly. She gestured toward my yard again but said nothing new. The officer nodded and began walking past her, motioning for his partner to follow. She stood there, momentarily stunned that they had walked right by her without further questioning. As they approached my yard, I greeted them politely. One of them asked if I was the homeowner, and I confirmed it. He asked what was going on, and I explained that it was just a Halloween event for families in the neighborhood. Nothing commercial, nothing illegal, just a few decorations, music, and laughter. He listened, glanced around again, and then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that says he already understood what this was really about. The second officer took a few steps toward the crowd, spoke briefly with a parent, and then came back shaking his head slightly, clearly unimpressed by the accusation. Meanwhile, the woman had followed them to the edge of my yard, still trying to assert control. She spoke over me, insisting that this was a clear violation of HOA policy and that I was ignoring repeated warnings. Her voice cracked under the strain of anger and embarrassment. The officer closest to her raised a hand gently, asking her to lower her voice. He told her that the noise levels were within acceptable limits and that nothing here posed a threat to public safety. The words landed like a stone dropping into water. The silence that followed was deep and immediate. The parents began smiling openly now, and the children giggled softly. The woman stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her hands clenched at her sides. The officer looked at her once more and asked in a calm tone if she was the one who had made the call. She nodded stiffly. Then he asked if she understood that filing a false or exaggerated report could be considered a disturbance in itself. Her eyes widened. She tried to explain that she was only doing her duty as a resident concerned for safety, but her words stumbled and fell apart before they could form a coherent defense. The officers thanked me for my cooperation and told me to have a good night. Then they turned to her and suggested she head home before things became unnecessarily complicated. The look on her face shifted from righteous confidence to silent humiliation. Around us, the laughter began to rise again, cautious at first, then free and full of relief. The children started running through the fog once more, the parents clapping lightly in amusement. The red and blue lights still danced on the pumpkins, but now they seemed to glow with warmth instead of fear. The woman turned and walked away slowly, her robe dragging behind her, her power dissolving with every step. I stood quietly on my porch, watching her door close, knowing that for the first time, she had faced the one thing she could not control, the truth. The air felt different now, lighter yet charged, as if the night itself waited for something to unfold. The officers stood quietly in front of my yard, their flashlights cutting faint lines through the mist. One of them asked for my identification, his tone polite and professional. I handed it over with a calm smile, my hand steady even though my heart was beating hard enough to feel in my chest. He glanced at it, nodded once, and returned it to me with a small look of reassurance that told me he already knew what this situation really was. Then he turned toward the woman across the street. She stood with her arms folded tightly, her robe now clinging awkwardly around her, her face tense with the determination of someone who could not afford to lose control. The officer asked her to explain where the problem was. She began again, louder than before, waving her hands toward my yard as she spoke about witches, satanic decorations, and fog that could poison the air. Her voice echoed against the nearby houses, but no one responded. Neighbors had gathered quietly behind fences and porches, their phones raised to capture the moment. The camera lights blinked like fireflies in the dark, recording every second of her outburst. The officer let her speak, his expression unreadable. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, He tilted his head slightly and asked in a calm voice what exact law had been broken. She hesitated, the words stalling on her tongue. He looked at her again, then at his notepad, and said that they had received the noise complaint from her address and that the sound levels in the area were completely within the legal limit. He added that no laws had been violated and that everything appeared peaceful. For a moment, she looked as if she had been struck by something invisible. Her mouth opened, then closed again without sound. The children in the crowd began to whisper, their eyes wide with curiosity. A few parents chuckled softly, unable to hide their amusement. The woman's confidence melted with each passing second. She tried to insist that the situation was inappropriate, that it offended her values, but her voice no longer carried power. The officer reminded her that Halloween celebrations were permitted and that personal discomfort was not a crime. The more he spoke, the redder her face became. Her hand tightened around her phone, trembling slightly. One of the neighbors whispered something that made others laugh. She turned toward them sharply, her eyes flashing with fury, but the sight of multiple cameras pointed in her direction stopped her from saying anything. The tension that had once made the air heavy began to shift into something else, something close to collective relief. The power she had held over the neighborhood was slipping away in front of everyone, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The officer took a small step back, crossing his arms as he looked at her. He thanked her for being vigilant but added that unnecessary emergency calls could waste valuable resources and create confusion. The message was clear, though delivered politely. She tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. She mumbled something about maintaining order, about being a responsible resident, but the words sounded weak and hollow now. The officers exchanged a look and began to turn away, signaling that the matter was settled. The crowd started to stir, laughter returning like a slow wave. Parents smiled, children clapped their hands, and someone quietly began to play Halloween music again. The atmosphere filled with life, brighter than before, as if everyone had decided at once to reclaim the night. The woman stood motionless, her face pale, her robe slightly slipping from one shoulder, her authority evaporating into the same fog she had tried to banish. She finally turned toward her house, her steps quick and uneven, the sound of scattered laughter following her all the way to her door. The officers nodded at me before walking back to their car. As the red and blue lights began to fade down the street, I looked around at the neighbors still gathered outside. Their faces glowed with the kind of satisfaction that only justice delivered in real time can bring. For once, the woman who ruled with fear had become the spectacle she never wanted to be. And as the fog drifted across the pumpkins again, the night felt truly free. The laughter that had once filled the street began to quiet as the woman tried to regain the control she had lost. Her face was flushed, her breathing uneven, her voice trembling between anger and desperation. She raised her arms toward the crowd, shouting that everyone was mocking her faith and destroying the moral foundation of the neighborhood. The words cut through the night like an accusation meant for every person standing there. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions calm but tired, as if they had seen this kind of scene too many times before. Children stood close to their parents, watching with wide eyes, unsure whether to be frightened or amused. The woman kept shouting, her voice rising with every sentence, feeding off the silence that surrounded her. The officers approached her slowly, asking her to calm down, but she would not stop. She ranted about corruption, evil, and how the community had lost its soul. Her words came out in bursts, broken and uneven, each one louder than the last. The parents whispered to each other, some trying to hold back their laughter, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The children remained quiet until one small voice pierced through the tension. A little boy standing near the sidewalk looked up at his mother and asked why that lady hated Halloween. His innocent question carried through the air, simple yet sharp, cutting deeper than any argument could. A few people laughed softly, not at the woman but at the truth of the child's words. The woman froze for a brief second, her mouth tightening as she tried to collect herself. Instead of stopping, she shouted even louder, saying that the entire event was an offense to decent people and that the neighborhood would pay for ignoring her warnings. The officers raised their hands in a calm gesture, asking her to lower her voice. When she refused, one of them warned her that she was on the edge of being cited for disorderly conduct. The mention of the word citation sent a visible shiver through her. She turned toward them, eyes wide, demanding to know why they were taking my side. The officer replied quietly that there was no side, only facts, and the facts were simple. No one had broken any law except the one she was coming dangerously close to violating herself. Her anger began to crumble under the weight of that truth. She took a step back, fumbling with her robe as she tried to gather the last pieces of her dignity. That was when the final humiliation came. As she moved, the pocket of her robe opened slightly, and a folded stack of papers fell onto the pavement. The nearest beam of light caught the words printed across the top. It was a petition to ban Halloween from the neighborhood, complete with spaces for signatures that were still blank. The officer bent down, picked it up, and looked at it for a moment before handing it back to her. His face remained neutral, but the crowd could not hold back anymore. Laughter erupted, first as small chuckles, then as full bursts of amusement that rippled through the street. She stood frozen, the color draining from her face. She mumbled something under her breath, clutching the papers to her chest as though they could protect her from the embarrassment. The laughter grew louder, blending with the faint hum of the patrol car's lights. Even the children began giggling, their earlier fear replaced by fascination at the sight of authority turned upside down. The officers did not laugh, but one of them gave a small shake of his head, as if silently acknowledging the absurdity of what had just happened. The woman took a step backward, then another, her robe slipping further down her shoulder. Her voice was gone now, replaced by a quiet that said everything words could not. Finally, she turned and hurried back toward her house, the fabric of her robe brushing against the pavement, the lights flashing behind her like a spotlight marking her retreat. The sound of her door slamming echoed across the street, followed by another wave of laughter. Parents clapped, children cheered, and the officers nodded to me one last time before walking back to their car. The red and blue lights slowly faded as the patrol vehicle pulled away, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed by that unforgettable moment. The woman who had ruled with fear had been undone by her own need for control, and that night, under the glow of pumpkins and laughter, everyone knew they had witnessed something that would be retold for years to come. The next morning arrived quiet and bright, the kind of stillness that usually follows a storm. The neighborhood looked ordinary again, but something in the air had changed. The woman who had once controlled everyone with fear had lost her grip. It started slowly, with a few messages appearing on the local community board, and then it spread like wildfire. Videos of the incident from the night before began circulating in every group chat and neighborhood forum. Each clip captured her shouting, waving her arms, accusing everyone of wrongdoing while the police stood calmly beside her. The headlines under the clips called her the HOA Halloween Karen, and by noon, everyone knew the name. The comments were relentless. People who had once stayed silent found their courage behind their screens. They wrote about how she had harassed families for years, about how she had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom. Others posted jokes and memes, some cruel but others simply amused by how her need for control had turned against her. The once feared woman was now a symbol of everything people had grown tired of: control without compassion, power without kindness. Every time I scrolled, I saw another reminder that the balance in our little world had finally shifted. By afternoon, the homeowners association was forced to respond. Their inbox was overflowing with angry messages demanding accountability. A meeting was held, brief but decisive. Within hours, a statement appeared on the community website acknowledging a misuse of authority and promising that future HOA matters would be handled with fairness and respect. It did not mention her by name, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who they were talking about. The silence from her house was louder than any apology could have been. That evening, I stepped outside and looked at my yard. The pumpkins were still there, their carved faces slightly softened by the morning sun. The fog machine sat quietly by the porch, waiting. For a moment, I considered packing everything away, ending the chapter and moving on. But then I heard the laughter of a few children down the street and saw them stop to look at my decorations. Their eyes lit up with the same joy I had seen the night before, and I realized that taking everything down would be giving her the victory she had already lost. So I began setting up again, this time not for revenge but for peace. As the lights flickered on, one by one, the sound of laughter returned. Parents brought their kids over, thanking me for standing firm when everyone else had been afraid. Some of them brought small gifts, others just smiles. The night came alive again, not in defiance but in celebration. For the first time, the street felt like a real community instead of a collection of houses ruled by one person's ego. The energy was warm, genuine, and free. When the familiar sound of an engine rolled down the street, I turned and saw the same police car from the night before. The officer who had handled the situation slowed as he passed by. He rolled down his window, his face calm but amused, and looked at the lights glimmering through the fog. "Nice decorations," he said before driving off, and those two words carried more satisfaction than any apology ever could. I stood there for a long moment, the soft hum of laughter filling the air around me. The lights shimmered gently across the pumpkins, and the night finally felt still again. I smiled, not because I had won against her, but because peace had returned to the place where control had once lived. A week passed and the memory of that wild Halloween night had settled into local legend. The neighborhood had returned to its calm rhythm, but a quiet current of amusement lingered beneath the surface. Every time people walked past my house, they smiled a little longer, and sometimes I caught them whispering to each other before breaking into soft laughter. It was as if the entire street carried a shared secret that bound us together. The woman's house, however, remained silent. Curtains always drawn, no footsteps on the porch, no clipped reminders taped to doors. She had vanished into the background she once controlled, and her absence was the most peaceful sound the neighborhood had ever known. One morning, as I stepped outside to collect my mail, I noticed a single envelope lying on the edge of the porch. There was no return address, just my name written in neat block letters. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if it might be another complaint. But curiosity won. I opened it and pulled out a small folded note. The first line made me laugh aloud. It read, "Congratulations on Best House Display." The words were followed by a smiley face drawn in blue ink. Beneath the note was a printed photograph. I turned it over and froze. It was the image that had spread across the neighborhood, the exact moment when the woman stood beside the police car, mouth open in outrage, her robe half undone, her petition slipping from her pocket. The photo was perfectly framed, crisp and clear, a trophy of poetic justice captured forever. I stood there on the porch, sunlight warming my face, unable to stop smiling. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what this meant. It wasn't just a prank. It was a small, shared acknowledgement from the neighborhood, a thank you for standing firm when no one else dared. I slipped the picture back into the envelope and carried it to the garage. Inside, on the wall above my workbench, hung the tools and decorations I used every year. I cleared a small space and placed the photo inside a simple frame. The moment I hung it, something about it felt complete. The story had come full circle. What had begun as an act of control had ended as a symbol of freedom, laughter, and community. As the days passed, people continued to mention that night with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Some said it would never be forgotten. Others joked about making it an annual tradition. A few neighbors stopped by to ask if I planned to decorate again. Their smiles told me they already knew the answer. When the next Halloween arrived, I began setting up early, adding new touches to the display. But this time, I included something special. In the corner of the yard, just beside the witch and the pumpkins, I placed a mannequin dressed in a flowing yellow robe. In its hand was a fake citation made of cardboard, the letters written boldly enough for anyone to read. The children giggled when they saw it. The parents called it brilliant. By evening, everyone was referring to it by the same name, Karen the Ghost. The laughter that filled the street that night was different from before. It wasn't nervous or forced. It was genuine, full of release, as if the neighborhood had collectively exhaled after years of tension. People took photos beside the mannequin, smiling and posing, turning what had once been a nightmare into a celebration of resilience. Every flicker of light reflected on that yellow robe reminded me how far things had come. The sound of laughter, once something she tried to silence, now lived on as a reminder that community always outlasts control. When the night deepened and the decorations glowed against the fog once more, I stood back and looked at everything I had built. The house shimmered in gold and orange, the air filled with joy and life. Somewhere behind closed curtains, I imagined her watching quietly, unable to erase the memory she had created for everyone else. I reached for the switch that powered the lights, smiled to myself, and whispered softly into the night, "Boo, and thank you." It wasn't said with spite or anger, but with quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes when the world finally restores its balance. The lights flickered to life, the pumpkins grinned, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood glowed with peace.